On this episode of Newt's World, in his new book, Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, Edward Fishman takes us deep into the back rooms of power to reveal the untold history of the last 2 decades of U.S. foreign policy, in which America renounced the gospel of globalization and waged a new kind of economic war. As Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Ayatollah Khamenei wreaked havoc on the world stage, mavericks within the U.S. government built a fearsome new arsenal of economic weapons, exploiting America's dominance in global finance and technology. Successive U.S. presidents have relied on these unconventional weapons to address the most pressing national security threats for good and for ill. Economic warfare has become the primary way the United States confronts international crises and counters rivals. Sometimes it has achieved spectacular success, other times bitter failure. The result we live with today is a new world order, an economic arms race among great powers, and a fracturing global economy. I can't imagine a more appropriate time to have this discussion. So, here to discuss his new book, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Edward Fishman. He is a leading authority on economic statecraft and sanctions. He teaches at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Previously he served at the U.S. State Department as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff at the Pentagon, as an advisor to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and at the U.S. Treasury Department as a special assistant to Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Edward, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for having me on today.
I'm very curious about your own background. How did you end up getting into this kind of economic project?
Yeah, so it really dates back to my time as a college student at Yale in the years after 9/11. I was studying history and learning about how we were living in a unipolar moment. America was the world's sole superpower. But then when I was just following the news and seeing America struggle to get what we wanted in places like Iraq and Afghanistan in those 2 wars, it just didn't add up to me. And it made me think that perhaps we weren't using our power as effectively as we could to advance American interests abroad. And it was right at that time that Iran's nuclear weapons program, right in the sort of mid-2000s, became the top national security priority for the United States. Because folks may remember that when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president in 2005 of Iran, he would routinely threaten to wipe Israel off the face of the earth, and he restarted nuclear enrichment programs. And there was a real threat that Iran could transfer nuclear material to a terrorist proxy like Hamas or Hezbollah or even Al-Qaeda, and that we could have a nuclear 9/11, basically a terrorist attack on U.S. soil that was an order of magnitude worse than the 9/11 attacks. But of course, at the time, there was no appetite politically to fight another war in the Middle East. We're already fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so it was right around that time that a guy at the Treasury Department named Stuart Levy started pioneering new forms of financial sanctions to try to actually put pressure on Iran and then maybe negotiate away their nuclear program. As I was watching this as a student, I was just fascinated. And I actually wrote to Stuart asking if he could bring me on as an intern. And it turned out that he was actually in the process of leaving. This was in 2011. But his successor was kind enough to offer me a job as his special assistant. And so within a few days of graduating college, I moved down to Washington, D.C. and joined the Treasury Department as the special assistant to the Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, and then had the good fortune of getting to work on things like the Iran sanctions that led to the first nuclear deal, and then the Russia sanctions in 2014 after Putin invaded Ukraine for the first time.
From your perspective, have sanctions worked? Have they achieved the goals we wanted?
People often ask me, do sanctions work, right? The thing that I find a little curious is, and I also had the good fortune of doing a stint at the Pentagon working for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Marty Dempsey. And one thing I never heard at the Pentagon asked was, does a bomb work? Well, yeah, bombs work quite well to blow things up, but they don't always get you what you want politically. And I think sanctions are very similar, particularly American sanctions, because the U.S. controls the key choke points in the global economy, like the U.S. dollar, advanced semiconductor technology. The United States has the ability to impose really devastating economic harm on foreign countries. Even just with the stroke of the pen, President Trump, any other president, can really exact quite a bit of pressure on foreign governments. The question is, can we translate that pressure into the political outcomes we seek? I think with respect to Iran, we were quite successful in changing the calculus of the Iranian regime and the idea that they should actually come to the table and negotiate on the nuclear program. I think with Russia, we've struggled, frankly, to change Putin's calculus. And I think the concern there isn't so much that we haven't been able to harm Russia's economy. It's that Putin has routinely doubted Western resolve and doubted our willingness to actually wage economic warfare against Russia with the determination it would take over years.
In a sense, it's also a function of how tough your adversary is and the level of pain they want to put up with.
Yes, I think that's exactly right.
As you know, the president has emergency authority to raise and lower tariffs that has been delegated to him by Congress. And we're talking the week that he had what he called Liberation Day, which I'm not sure is what any other country on the planet will call it. But what is your take on his whole approach to trying to develop individualized reciprocal tariffs?
You started off by talking about the emergency authority that the president has. This is a 1977 law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And that law has been used to give the president authority to impose financial sanctions on Iran and Russia and North Korea and other, rogue regimes. What it hasn't been used for up until now, actually for the first time during the second Trump administration, is tariffs. So the first time that that law has ever been used for tariffs was when Trump on February 1st imposed the 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico on the fentanyl and migration crisis and the initial 10% tariff on China. The new tariffs that Trump put in place on this so-called Liberation Day were also justified by this law, the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act. However, I think there's some doubt within the legal community about whether this ultimately will hold up in court, because that law really is supposed to be used for national security crises. What Trump has said is that the trade deficit overall gives him blanket authority to impose this massive tariff. The issue is, despite what Trump says, a tariff is a tax, right? So American importers are going to be paying these tariffs. And so there's a real question, I think, that lawyers and courts will need to work out whether the president does have the authority to just unilaterally impose taxes this way. Because if these tariffs do remain in place, Mr. Speaker, the economic analysis that I've seen suggests that it could be the largest single act of tax increases in American history in one sort of fell swoop. And so if the president has that authority, I think it's a bit of an abandonment, frankly, of the Congress's authority to raise taxes in association with the president.
It would require the Congress to pass some limitation with a veto overriding majority.
Well, I think there's a question. I mean, it's possible that the tariffs themselves are ultimately enjoined in court, because there's a question whether the president's authorities under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act allow him to impose a unilateral, universal tariff the way that he has, right? Because in addition to the reciprocal tariff, he's also imposed a 10% universal tariff on every other country in the world. Let's say that it does hold up, because you also asked me, do I think it's a good idea? I think that the United States has benefited largely from the structure of the international economy as it's existed since World War II. There have been sacrifices the United States made. Of course, it's not been all good things. And I think certainly with respect to China, we've for too long allowed China to do things like steal intellectual property from American companies, bar U.S. companies from accessing the Chinese market without really retaliating at all. And I credit President Trump during his first term for really starting to fight back against Chinese economic aggression. And this is something that President Biden built upon. I think what is a bit more questionable is the idea that we should be imposing massive tariffs on everybody else, including our allies and other emerging economies that want to be closely associated with the United States, like a country like Vietnam, for instance, which I think in a sort of perverse fashion under these Trump tariffs has a higher tariff rate than China.
You did an article for Politico where you suggested that Trump could learn a lot from Nixon's Treasury Secretary William Simon and how he used both economic and military incentives to preserve U.S. power. Talk a little bit about Simon. What was it that he understood and that he did so well?
Yeah, I think Bill Simon is a good person for us to look back to now, because in some ways he has a lot in common with President Trump and others in the current Trump administration. He was a career bond trader on Wall Street, was not someone who was really typically involved in politics. He initially joined the Nixon administration as the energy czar, and actually was in that position when the Arab oil embargo happens in 1973. And he has this funny quote where he actually admits that he's the guy who caused the lines at the gas stations in America. So I think if he had said that at the time, there may have been people with pitchforks outside of his house. But I think this was something he said in retrospect. In 1974, we were not in a great place as a country. Nixon had just in 71 unilaterally delinked the dollar from gold because countries had lost faith in the value of the dollar. It was initially pegged at $35 an ounce, and this was something we could not defend any longer. We started running massive deficits because of the Vietnam War. We lost our position as the world's leading oil producer. And then, of course, we're hit with a big embargo from the Saudis after the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And we were entering a period of very low economic growth and high inflation, right? This idea that has now been called stagflation. And what the biggest problem that Simon saw at the time was that the U.S. just couldn't continue running the deficits that it was running. And so he had to come up with a formula for this. And as Nixon is kind of struggling amid the Watergate scandal, he appoints Simon as Treasury Secretary in May of 1974. And Simon comes up with, I think, what winds up being this quite ingenious idea, which is that he wants to convince the Saudi government, which is getting paid all of these dollars for its oil, to take the dollars that it's generating and reinvest them in U.S. government debt, to reinvest them in treasuries. And the idea he comes up with isn't to try to bully the Saudis into doing it, but really to try to cut a deal, right? This sort of transactionalism that some people talk about in association with President Trump. So in July of 1974, he hops on a plane, flies to Jeddah. Interestingly enough, on that plane, winds up indulging in copious amounts of whiskey, so gets nice and drunk before this meeting, which is, I guess, funny too, because at the time Saudi Arabia had banned alcohol. And he goes into the meeting with the Saudi government, and he offers them the ability to buy U.S. treasuries outside of the normal auctions, and also to get access to U.S. military equipment in exchange for agreeing to price oil in dollars and to recycle the dollars that Saudi Arabia was generating into U.S. government debt, basically to plug the U.S. deficit with the dollars that America was paying it. And this is what then became known as the petrodollar and has basically undergirded the entire dollar-based financial system and, frankly, the way that America finances its government ever since. Because to this day, it is foreigners who are essentially allowing us to run these budget deficits year after year. And so I think the lesson for Trump is if you think about how Simon got the Saudis to agree to this deal, it wasn't by threatening military action against Saudi Arabia or sanctions against Saudi Arabia. It was coming with carrots. It was showing the Saudis what was in their interests in terms of linking their financial system and their economy to the United States. And so what I'm hoping happens is in the coming weeks and months after this initial tariff barrage, that Trump can actually move to the carrot and start actually finding ways to incentivize other countries to cut deals with the United States and move their economies closer to us, as opposed to pushing them into the laps of the Chinese Communist Party, which I fear is what will happen if these tariffs remain in place indefinitely.
One of the points that you make is that this sustains the dollar. What would have happened if the Saudis had decided that they were going to denominate in Swiss francs or in euros or Chinese yuan? I mean, how would that have changed the world and the American situation?
There's a few ways to answer it. I think on a macro level, the petrodollar really became the linchpin of an overall dollarized global financial system. Back in the 1970s, you basically had a very tiny foreign exchange market. It effectively didn't exist. Today, you've got something like $7 trillion in turnover every single day in foreign exchange, and 90% of those trades involve the dollar. And so what that does is it gives the American government this enormous leverage that we can threaten to cut other countries off from the dollar. We can basically come and, if we need to, resolve global financial crises by offering swap lines. This is what's made the U.S. Federal Reserve kind of the center of the global financial system. And then from just a domestic perspective, there's a lot of benefits. This is why many have called the dollar's role an exorbitant privilege. First of all, other countries, other governments, other companies always have demand for dollars, really regardless of the fiscal situation in the United States. And this is what has enabled the United States to run budget deficits. The other piece, and this actually is a bit of a double-edged sword, although I think the benefits outweigh the costs, and this is another thing we can explore because it's part of the rationale for some people in the Trump administration to be seeking this so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord. which is that it makes the dollar more valuable than it would be otherwise. Because normally the value of your currency is just based on your terms of trade. But because there's such a huge demand for American assets, the dollar is stronger than it would be based on just our trading position. And so what that does on the plus side is it means that every American has more purchasing power than they would otherwise. Their salaries allow them to buy more goods than they would if the dollar were valued more cheaply. The downside of it, and the thing that some people in the Trump administration don't like, is it weakens the export competitiveness of certain sectors in the United States. It makes their goods more expensive than they would be on foreign markets. And so folks who believe that we need to revive manufacturing in the United States have often thought that we need to weaken the value of the dollar. What I would say, though, is weakening the value of the dollar would help a segment of society, manufacturers who are trying to export on global markets, but it would harm everyone because we're all paid in dollars. And so our paychecks would not go as far. And so I think ultimately, as you know better than anyone, politics involves trade-offs. There's no policy where everyone's a winner. And so you got to pick ultimately what's your priority and how many people you can help versus hurt with a specific policy.
As you look at the way the system's evolving right now, how real is the danger that China could create an alternative reserve currency?
I think it's very real. What China has been doing is they've been building effectively parallel infrastructure to the dollar-based system. After 2014, after we imposed sanctions on Russia for the annexation of Crimea, China started developing an alternative to the SWIFT system, which is this financial messaging system based in Brussels called CIPS, or the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System. It started small, but it's been growing very, very rapidly. And so I think the trajectory of growth is such that if it keeps on growing at this pace, eventually it will be not quite as large as SWIFT, but a significant competitor. They've also done things like launch a central bank digital currency, the digital RMB, which they launched in 2020. And of course, the United States does not have an answer to this. There's no digital dollar or anything that we've responded to. The biggest impediment to the RMB actually challenging the dollar is, of course, China's own political system. Authoritarian, unmoored to the rule of law, arbitrary, and with capital controls, right? If you have an investment in China, it's not clear that you'll be able to get your money out. I think the key for China would be, are they willing to be more predictable as a player? Are they willing to loosen capital controls? I think if they were to be willing to go in that direction, they would pose a threat to the dollar. The thing I'd say, though, before I pass it back to you, is that the RMB isn't the only potential rival to the dollar, right? You also have the euro, which in some ways has many of the same benefits that the dollar has, and that most people trust European courts. The euro is a freely convertible currency. There aren't capital controls on it. You already have something like 20% of global foreign exchange that's denominated in euros compared to 60% in dollars. The biggest impediment for Europe, of course, has been that they don't issue joint debt, right? They don't have a fiscal union. But right now, with Europe really seriously pondering a big rearmament program, and with a new chancellor in Germany, it's possible that the Europeans could come around to joint debt issuance. And I think that in some ways could wind up posing a threat to the dollar in the near term more so than the Chinese RMB.
The process that you're describing is compounded, I think, by the whole situation that Trump is doing with the tariffs. In a sense, we're sort of rattling the whole system.
I think that's right. And I think on the most basic level, what the tariffs have done so far is they've been really bad for American asset prices, right? The stock market is down something like 25% from its peak in February. And so what that has done is it's led asset managers to reallocate their investments from the United States to other countries, to Europe, actually, number one. And there's actually something that's very interesting that I believe could be a canary in the coal mine about the real threat that we see to the dollar today, which is that economic theory suggests that if you impose tariffs, your currency actually should strengthen because Americans would have smaller demand for foreign currency. But what we've seen is with all these tariffs, the dollar has actually weakened quite a bit. And I think that's because of this loss of confidence in the American market because of the tariffs. And then secondarily, I think there's a fear around the world about Trump's use of economic warfare. I think no matter what Trump did, because of, honestly, presidents dating back to George W. Bush, Obama, Trump's first term, we were never going to get China and Russia or Iran to feel comfortable relying on American-controlled economic systems, right? We've declared them as our adversaries, and we've been waging economic warfare against them now for years. But what is new so far is really this economic warfare against everybody else, right? Against the Canadas, Mexicos, Europes, now even Vietnam, Japan, South Korea. I think that's the thing that really risks a broader referendum on the dollar. And that's why I'm hoping that Trump ultimately views these tariffs more as negotiating leverage that he can eventually peel back, as opposed to something that's going to be a permanent feature of our world.
In your mind, this is sort of a stage setter rather than a permanent experience.
I'm expressing my hope. We've heard a lot of goals attached to the tariffs, right? We've heard the tariffs as a potential revenue raiser, right? Maybe as a way to justify a new tax cut or extension of the original tax cuts. We've heard as tariffs as a way to protect American domestic manufacturing. And we've also heard of tariffs as a way to get deals with foreign countries on various issues, ranging from migration to lowering their own tariffs. The thing is, these goals, many of them are at cross purposes with one another. If you want tariffs to incentivize American companies to invest in the United States and onshore manufacturing, you got to tell those companies that these tariffs are going to be in place for decades, right? Or otherwise, they're not going to shell out the investment domestically to actually move manufacturing back to the United States. But then that then undermines our negotiating leverage, because if we've already committed to these tariffs being in place for decades, how are we then going to incentivize foreign countries to do what we want? So I'm expressing a hope. You would know, frankly, better than me what might be in Trump's mind. But so far, we've seen that these are various goals he has. There are different factions in the administration duking it out. And I just hope that the deal maker Trump triumphs over the protectionist Trump.
In a world where people really want stability, we are now guaranteeing them a couple of years of pretty amazing instability, I think. I don't quite understand on the banking side, we're able to have an extraordinary level of control over how people have transactions internationally.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And what's the practical effect of that?
You know, my book is called Chokepoints because what happened really in the 1990s, in the wake of this hyper-globalization, when you bring countries like China and Russia and the countries in the former Soviet bloc into global financial systems, into this dollar-based financial system that originates with Bill Simon's trip to Saudi Arabia in the early 70s, what you get is a system where even when two countries trade with each other, let's say China trading with Saudi Arabia, more often than not, that trade is settled in US dollars, right? So when countries are buying oil, no matter what their currency is, they're paying the Saudis in the dollar. They're not paying in their home currency. And if you think about it, just practically speaking, think about all the currencies in the world, it wouldn't make sense for a Saudi bank to hold every single type of currency, right? So what banks do is they tend to hold big stores of their own currency. So in the Saudi case, the Saudi riyal, and then the dollar. And when they want to do business internationally, they'll take the dollar and exchange that for the currency that they need. It's basically, the way I say it in my book, is trying to do business internationally without access to the dollar. It's kind of like traveling without access to a passport. That's really the systemic significance of the dollar. And so this key choke point, what it does is it allows the president to say to a foreign bank, you know, you don't have access to the dollar anymore, in which case they're basically shut off from this global financial system. And so it is a tremendous lever that the president has at his disposal. It's one that's worked tremendously well against countries like Iran and Russia. And frankly, I think it's a more effective geopolitical tool than, for instance, tariffs, which wind up having broad-based effects on Americans ourselves, right? Because all Americans wind up paying higher prices for goods when you're using tariffs instead of financial sanctions.
When you have this kind of approach, to what extent can you actually coerce countries just by economic pressure? I've been watching Trump recently as he gets more frustrated with Putin, and he's starting to talk about dramatically deepening and expanding the sanctions, which I assume means in some way using the international banking system. How would that work?
People have asked, well, Russia's economy is sort of muddling through. They haven't fully collapsed. Doesn't this show that the sanctions aren't as strong as we thought they were? The truth is, the Russians are not sanctions evasion magicians. They haven't come out with this secret code that allows them to bypass this dollar system we've talked about. What happened was, frankly, the United States fought this economic war since 2022 with one hand tied behind our back. Joe Biden was unwilling ultimately to go after Russia's oil sales for fear of worsening inflation domestically and potentially spiking prices at the pump for Americans. And I understand why he had this mentality in 2022. You had oil prices above $100 a barrel and inflation at a 4-decade high, the highest it had been since about William Simon's time in the 1970s. The thing is, though, the situation is very different now. Inflation is under control. Oil prices are the lowest they've been in years. There's something almost closer to $60 a barrel at the time that we're talking. And so there's quite a bit of flexibility I think Trump does have to crack down on Russian oil sales. What would that look like? It would mean threatening foreign buyers of Russian oil, be they oil traders in places like Dubai or refineries in places like China, with being cut off from the dollar-based system if they continue buying Russian oil. You'd have to structure this cleverly. You couldn't ask them to go to zero overnight because Russia is a giant seller of oil. They're selling like 5 million barrels of crude oil a day. But what you could do is you could say that you can only continue buying Russian oil if every 3 to 6 months you're significantly reducing the amount of purchases that you have. So you basically build a glide path that over a 6 to 12 month period or an 18-month period, Russian oil sales have significantly dropped. And I think the other benefit of creating that kind of glide path is it also sends a market signal to shale producers in places like my home state of Pennsylvania or Texas or Louisiana that they need to drill more oil and basically have more product on global markets to compensate for the loss of Russian exports. So I think there is this formula where Trump could impose significant pressure on Russia while also advancing his goal that he stated of American energy dominance.
That would be the kind of sophisticated economic strategy which might well coerce Putin, because if they don't have oil sales, they don't have anything. Their whole economy will grind to a halt. But that does require a very tough-minded, with India, with China, with others, convincing them that they have to do this.
It's not easy. Look, one of my early jobs in government, my first job at the State Department after I moved over from Treasury, is I was on the Iran sanctions team responsible for Asia. So I had to go to places like Singapore and Malaysia and talk to shipping companies and oil companies and basically warn them that if they kept doing business with Iran, that we would cut them off from the U.S. financial system. And I know you've engaged with diplomacy. These conversations are not the nicest conversations, right? And they're not pleasant to have. And oftentimes countries don't like hearing it. And so you better have a good reason. And I think what helped us back in that period in 2012, 2013, there are a couple things. First of all, we had the backing of the U.S. Congress. So the U.S. Congress had imposed these sanctions with veto-proof majorities. And so I could credibly say as an American diplomat that I'm here just implementing American law. I don't have a choice whether or not to be here. So I think there is a real, urgency for Congress to get in the game, not just Trump. I think the second thing we had at our disposal is we had a viable strategy. We would say, look, we don't want these sanctions to be in place indefinitely. We want a nuclear deal. We're trying to do this so that we can get a peaceful resolution to Iran's nuclear program that doesn't involve going to war. And that was oftentimes persuasive. So I think that in some ways, the stars are aligned right now for a similar strategy with Trump, where Trump can credibly say that he wants to negotiate peace, that he's willing to sort of sit down with Zelensky and with Putin. But I think that he's going to need significant leverage over Putin to get Putin to be serious, because it's clear he's got leverage over Zelensky. He's used that leverage in spades over the last couple months. But what we don't have right now is enough leverage over Putin to get him to take this diplomacy seriously.
Given Putin's background as a KGB agent and the degree to which he is passionately committed to a great Russia strategy, do you think there's any level of economic pain that would stop him?
I mean, economic pain alone is always a tough sell, right? But I think what you got to look at is the overall situation that Putin is in right now, where the war that he's fighting is not one that has broad support in the Russian society. Yes, people will say that they support the war, but do they want to be drafted and put on the front lines in Ukraine? No. Do they want their kids to be drafted and put on the front lines in Ukraine? No, right? Russia's had hundreds of thousands of casualties. I mean, this has been a catastrophe for Russia. And so there's pressure, I think, from society in and of itself to potentially wind down the war. What can economic pressure do? I think what it will do is it will add another dimension to that. Because so far, Russia's economy has kind of muddled through because of this enhanced military spending and kind of moving into a military-led economy that Putin has done over the last few years. But if all of a sudden you get into hyperinflation territory and a substantial recession in Russia, I do think there would be some pressure from society that Putin would have to respond to. And I think this is another important point about sanctions, and it's an unfortunate reality, is that governments that have no accountability whatsoever, it can be quite hard to get them to change their policies. And that's why I think sanctions have not worked well against, North Korea, for instance, or Cuba. But the Russian people, while, yes, they're living in an authoritarian state right now, they did get used to relatively high standards of living. And Putin was able to really ossify his control over Russia in the early 2000s because standards of living were going up. The Russian economy was doing better than it was in the 1990s. I think if that progress is rapidly undone, I do think he'll feel some pressure, both from below and, frankly, from people in his inner circle to change course.
It's a fascinating situation because the truth is that all of these leaders, whether it's Xi Jinping or it's Putin, in both of those cases, popular support matters. And I have a hunch that Khamenei, the Ayatollah, also is very worried about the larger Iranian population and whether or not, in fact, they're about. Now, I don't think when you get, say, to a North Korea that it has the same effect, or for that matter, Cuba, because they're very effective police states and they're very willing to be radically coercive. I originally was one of those people who thought that Deng Xiaoping's Southern tour, talking about the need for market economies, was actually a first step towards opening up Chinese society. I was embarrassed to realize that actually Deng Xiaoping was one of the 14 founding members of the Chinese Communist Party in Paris during World War I, went to Lenin University in Moscow for a year, and is a hardcore, totally dedicated Leninist. And what he was actually saying was, we need to have a market economy so we're doing well enough that they won't throw us out. It was actually a step towards consolidating the dictatorship, not reforming it. It's one of the reasons I had to really rethink a lot of what we were doing. I don't sense that you have the kind of party structure in Russia that you have in China. That's a very, very different environment.
Yeah. The Russian system is more personalist. It's sort of more rooted in the Russian intelligence services and Putin's own roots in the KGB. The government itself and the most powerful people are really what I would call Putin loyalists or Putin cronies. They're people that he has personally inserted in those roles. They're people who would not be within 1,000 miles of power if it weren't for being Putin's childhood judo partner or something like that. I don't think that we should get giddy, right, and think that, sanctions are going to cause regime change in Russia. I don't think that's plausible. I think what economic pressure can do is it can put pressure on Putin and give him a reason to actually cut a deal. Because, look, in some ways, Putin's already has, in some ways, what he wanted in 2014, which is he's got a land bridge to Crimea, right? They took Mariupol. They've connected the Crimean Peninsula by land to Russia. He does not control all of the oblasts that he has claimed to annex, but, would he be willing to back out of those and claim victory? I think he probably could claim victory to the Russian people. I don't think if he were to stop now, give up some of the territory he's conquered, but then also get to keep things like Crimea and parts of the Donbass, I don't think the Russian people would revolt. I think it's more likely that the Russian people revolt if you draft another 100,000 Russians and send them to fight and die in Ukraine. Meanwhile, while their standard of living is collapsing under oil sanctions that I hope the Trump administration will consider implementing.
I think that the Trump team is very serious about getting Putin's attention. They've been patient, they've been pleasant because that's a negotiating style, but down deep they're very, very serious about getting his attention.
Music to my ears. And look, I've heard comments from top Trump officials, like Scott Bessent, for instance, that do make me sanguine about the possibility of doing things like oil sanctions. If you look at Mike Waltz's writing before he became the national security advisor, or Marco Rubio's comments when he was in the Senate, they suggest that those people would be in favor of these types of sanctions. I think the real question is Trump on board? The thing that's interesting is, you may have seen this, there's a new Senate bill that's got, I think, 50 co-sponsors already, I think half Republicans, half Democrats, that would put very aggressive secondary oil sanctions on Russia. And so what I'm going to be looking for in the coming days and weeks is, what's the White House's perspective on this bill? Is this something that they're going to fight tooth and nail, in which case I doubt it goes anywhere because Speaker Johnson's not going to let it see the light of day? Or is it something that they see as, hey, this is our chance to have a real bad cop, to allow Congress to step up, impose some serious sanctions, and then give our diplomats some real leverage with Putin at the negotiating table?
Edward, I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. It is a very relevant book to exactly what we're doing right now, and I recommend that every citizen get a copy and read it, and I really appreciate you helping educate us.
Thanks so much for having me on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you to my guest, Edward Fishman. You can get a link to buy his new book, Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.